Christianity is just as violent as any other religion. This objection is made in various forms, but when people say that the violence, especially in the Old Testament, would be a objection to believing in Christianity, they've got some problems. First of all, you're forming conclusions about an entire belief system based on the actions of individuals. Say, for example, you wouldn't call all Muslims terrorists because members of it practice terrorism. You would have to go to their source material that inspired them and the historical example of their founder to form effective conclusions about whether or not the religion, not the individual, is violent or not. Because if an individual is violent and chooses to justify their behavior, that's different than a religion encouraging that behavior, especially if they only can find verses or references or records taken out of context. They would be the one in error, not the religion. But also note as well, just because something is violent doesn't make it false. World history is violent. Does that mean World Wars I and II weren't actual historical events because all the records we have of them are violent? Understand, you have to ask why violence took place, and then form conclusions as to whether or not it was just. The presence of violence doesn't prove or disprove anything. We need to be able to point that out. Then finally, when you receive these sort of objections in one form or another, you need to understand what is called the ad hoc fallacy, that you dismiss someone and what they're saying and what they're claiming to do when you're being accused of it. Now understand, and I'll restate that because it was a little conjoined. An ad hoc fallacy is when you dismiss what someone says by claiming they do the same thing. It says, well, you too, as if that changes the topic. It doesn't change the fact that you have still done the bad things, and the only way, not the good way, but the only way you can defend yourself is by changing the topic, which means that you don't have a good defense. So if I make the accusation, well, you're violent too, or Christians do this, or the Crusades, or Old Testament, does that actually state the real issue at heart here, that the religion commands violence? No, it doesn't prove or disprove anything. So especially with that second point in mind and saying, okay, does violence actually mean it's wrong? No, you have to ask why that violence took place, when it took place, under what circumstances, and conclude if there was something just. Now, I'm going to make some assumptions here. I think that if the Old Testament, and it does, records violence, especially wars declared on certain groups of people, I'll give 5 examples, then I would say it would be fair if A, they were given fair warning, B, they were given terms and conditions as to not get involved in that war, that there would be a means to avoid violence if they were given reasonable terms and conditions to avoid doing so, and finally, if they were treated ultimately in a way that fit the crimes that they were committing. If this was in response to an injustice or an infraction. If a nation attacks us and we retaliate, we're not evil, we're defending ourselves. But if we attack a nation and they have been given fair warning, they have been violating standards, reasonable standards, that they knew would result in war, that would also be fair. The way that Old Testament violence is oftentimes made is the same way that Islam's violence, or all the terrorist actions that are committed by Buddhists in India and in China, or not in, well, yes, in China as well, but noted communist regimes are more dominant there. Nonetheless, all these things are needed to be represented in their proper context. So, given 5 examples, what claims of Old Testament violence would be considered unjust? Well, of the ones that I can name, every single claim of violence in the Old Testament either was an event that shouldn't have happened, wasn't approved of, but was recorded as honest history, or in the sense of larger scale wars against nations. They all had a historical context of war after 400 plus years of mercy. and were only directed toward specific cultures that were aware that what they were doing would warrant these consequences. For example, the nation of Canaan was warned by Abraham in Genesis 15 around 2,000 years before Christ. Joshua, the one who conquered Canaan, didn't enter their nation's borders until 1410 BC. We can verify this through the archaeological remains of Jericho and when they were ultimately leveled. Also note that there were individuals, families, that were spared in Jericho, like Rahab, according to the very same book, only because they asked. We also have examples of entire nations being spared, like the Gibeonites within Canaan, who were under the same judgment, but because they asked for mercy, their request was honored. Now note, the conditions in which they made the request were dishonorable, but it's almost as if the God of the Bible was looking for an excuse. If they asked for mercy, even in the most underhanded of ways, he would respect and grant that. But continuing this on as well, Canaan was given almost 600 years before they answered for their crimes. And noting that there was a continual presence of people who were warning them in their nation, we have Melchizedek named as one who was the king of Salem, a Jebusite city, by the way, and was telling them about the true and living God, as well as his standards, and that the fact that they were burning their newborn infants alive, making child prostitution a rite of passage to the worship of Ashtoreth, and tribalistic warfare that bordered on the inhuman, dedicating houses by smashing skulls underneath them and so forth, that we can verify through archaeology, making rape basically a stamped requirement for entering their city so you know who was boss, and on it went. These sort of things went on for almost 600 years before they answered for it. They knew what they were doing was wrong. And 600 years of patience. That is more patience than I have. But I can't say that the war with Canaan was unjustified, especially given the fact that some were showed mercy when they simply asked for it. Also note, the Amalekites. This is another interesting one, because while the Canaanites were commanded to be driven out of the land, when it says you aren't to spare men, women, cattle, don't even leave those things alive, it also says in the next verse where that passage is cited, you shall not intermarry with them. Well, clearly there's some hyperbole going on there. But when the Amalekites were ordered to be exterminated, they really meant exterminated. And we know this because when the first king of Israel, Saul, was ordered to do exactly this, he was condemned and chastised by the prophet Samuel when he spared not only King Agag, but members of his family had managed to escape and would be additional problems for Israel down the line during the time of Esther. We'll get to that in a moment. Amalek was given a warning by Moses in 1450 BC when they literally attacked Israel terroristically, not militarily. They went after the rear of the camp because that's where the old, the young, and the infirm and the injured would be traveling by. They fought and targeted those who specifically couldn't fight back, just so they could show them who was boss. Now, as far as motives are concerned for Israel's part, they were attacked, they defended themselves, and said that war with Amalek will continue. Now, did Israel initiate that war? No. Amalek attacked Israel and said, this is your first warning. You're now at war with us, and our God will finish it if you guys don't stop attacking us. Now, we know that going all the way into the time of King David, they continued these terroristic raids on Israel's borders, going into and beyond, catch this, 1450 BC, all the way until Saul was ordered them in 1000 BC. 450 years this sort of aggression on Amalek's part was tolerated. Then, when they were finally answered for, they were given another couple centuries, from the time of King Saul in around 1000 BC to the time of Esther in the 600s BC. They were given 800 years of mercy total before the entire nation was wiped out. What happened in Esther? Well, a man by the name of Haman, who was an Agagite, was a reference to the last survivor of, at least the most prominent male survivor, of Saul's attack on the Amalekites' capital. And when the Amalekites were wiped out, but Agag was spared, his descendants, obviously, the survivors of this, that Saul wasn't supposed to spare. Well, we find out exactly why. Because Haman had gotten in good with the Persian government, and the king allowed him to host these parades for himself where he caused everyone to bow down and worship him. Now, during one of these daily worship me parades, Mordecai, who was a Jewish man, didn't bow down to anyone but the true and living God. So instead of standing defiantly and dishonoring a public official in a clear egotistical rant on his part, but granted, he wasn't this showy about it, he just went out of his way not to go home on that street. Now, Haman didn't know this. He didn't know who Mordecai was. He had to be informed by his servant and encouraged by his wife, Lady Macbeth style, in saying that this Jewish man doesn't want to worship you on your parades. And somehow the Amalekites, and I'm speaking this sarcastically just so you know, were so reasonable and reformed after their encounter with Saul that it suddenly went through Haman's mind in the book of Esther that, oh, one Jewish man doesn't want to attend my daily worship me parades? I'm going to exterminate every single person of his race. If there's any wonder why God wasn't keen on these people living in his land for much longer. Also note that when Haman set it up politically so that the Jews would be exterminated and they wouldn't be able to do anything about it, the counter to this, when Esther finally made the king aware of this plot, had Haman executed for attempting to murder his wife, as well as her culture and people. But on top of this as well, couldn't undo the laws that had already been signed. This is the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be altered. Another historical fact, by the way, the Bible got right before we were aware of it. But that point being made, he signed another law that would give the Jews the opportunity and equipment to defend themselves from any invaders, and the only individuals in the entire Persian kingdom that assailed these Jewish homes on the Slaughter the Jews Day were Haman's descendants, the Agagites, the Amalekites, and they wiped themselves out after failing to terrorize Israel one last time. After 800 years of mercy. Doesn't sound like an unreasonable display of violence to me. Likewise, the Philistines. We are familiar with those, especially if we watch VeggieTales. They were warned by the prophet Samuel in 1100 BC. After several acts of aggression throughout the time of Judges, the Philistines, the people of Philistia, were very well adept at trade, but they were also the individuals who had as a part of their culture and group the champion Goliath and his other brothers. Now, Samuel noted this, but didn't order them to be exterminated. He simply predicted it. They would be driven out of Israel, and their days would be no more. Now, when was this fulfilled? Well, according to the minor prophets and the Babylonian records outside of the Bible, King Nebuchadnezzar was the one who ultimately saw this through when he moved through the region of Israel during the 600s BC. So that's around 500 years of mercy given to the Philistines. When they attacked, Israel defended themselves. When they declared war, they fought them, but they didn't drive them out of the land. They didn't wipe them out. They didn't attack their civilian targets based on our records. But we do know when the Babylonians came through the Middle East that they were and were predicted to be God's instrument of judgment against them. We can read this in Isaiah and Ezekiel. Now, continuing, the Assyrians, which are in southern Turkey today, they were given a warning by Nahum in the 700s. Nebuchadnezzar didn't take them over until 100 years later. And also note as well, you may remember their first warning wasn't actually from Nahum, it was from Jonah, who was even earlier before this. And Jonah got to witness the entire city being spared from judgment. That at that moment in history, you can read the records of Herodotus, these guys were animals. They would mutilate corpses, they would gather up all the celebrities when they took over a city, behead them and stack their heads up in a pyramid in the public square so that every time people went out to socially interact and get involved in the trade and market, they would see this cloud of flies surrounding the decrepit skulls of the people they most looked up to and were familiar with and respected. That would be a daily reminder that the Assyrians were there not to make friends and influence people. Or I guess they were to influence people, but it wasn't friendly. Likewise, we have records of entire cities committing mass suicide lest they face siege by the Assyrians. We have another example. The reason for this, by the way, was a record that the Assyrian women were particularly adept at skinning prisoners. So when they captured local farmers before everyone had a chance to get inside the city fortress, they would take some of these prisoners and at incremented points outside the city, flay them alive and allow the city to hear their screams, so that that little audio track would be fresh on everybody's mind while the rest of the army moved in. This was what was known as winnowing tactics or terror tactics. Also note they had a very brutal way of treating their prisoners. When they were traveling with them, they would put hooks in their nose and other appendages as well and drag them by horse-drawn chariots. So these individuals would not only have to walk to keep up, but should they lag behind, they would get tugged by a very sensitive portion of the human anatomy. Most didn't survive this process, by the way. The Assyrians were a brutal people. And it was only after the prophet Nahum had warned them directly, after the prophet Jonah had also warned them directly, it was only a whole century after that that Nebuchadnezzar came through and didn't wipe them out. There are still Assyrians today, but certainly kept them from being a world influence and power until the modern day. And finally, Babylon. Babylon, even though they were used as an instrument and a tool of judgment by God, they weren't given a get-out-of-jail-free card if they committed war crimes. And going all the way back to the time of Micah and Isaiah and around the 800s BC, the Persians didn't take them over until the 500s. So you have 3 centuries of mercy while they're being made full aware that what they're doing is wrong in the eyes of God and they need to stop or they would answer for it. And also note as well these records of history, the God of the Bible saying the Persians defeated the Babylonians, the Assyrians were defeated by Babylon, the Philistines were defeated by Babylon, after Israel just essentially put up with them for centuries upon centuries. And all of these include warning after warning after warning. This violence seems rather restrained to me. Now note, going back to the first point, others aren't. We have examples of sexual assault taking place within the nation of Israel by Israelites, raping a prostitute to death who was the concubine of a priest who A, shouldn't have had a concubine, B, shouldn't have been traveling with her, let alone done anything but marry her if that was his intentions for the relationship. But B, or C, the whole issue was a disaster, and the book of Judges is one big slap in the face to Israel and letting them know this is what happens when you resort to anarchy, when you decide to govern yourselves. When they asked for a king, instead of just turning back to God, when they asked for a king, he became tyrannical and led wars that sometimes were just, other times were not, and even sometimes the just wars were done improperly. But this is just honest history, which actually increases the likelihood that these records are true, because they're admitting things that were even shameful to them, that violated their own standards. But if on the other hand I ask, okay, does the Bible command violence? Well, of all the times that specifically Christians could have committed violence, it probably would have been at the time when Jesus was about to be arrested. And if I remember in the Gospels, the record wasn't glowing when one of them took it on himself, not at an order from Jesus, but on himself, to try to defend Jesus through military arms. And what did Jesus say? Put your sword away. So, when St. Augustine came up with the just war theory, given his biblically informed perspective, he understood that warfare in a Christian sense was not something they could look at fondly. For the necessity of defending the oppressed, if it was in line with the nature of God, he developed the just war theory, but still acknowledged that Christians themselves recognized it as a necessary evil, not a righteous cause and calling. And it took a full 1,000 years removed from the Christian origins, the example of Jesus Christ, for somebody to get it into their mind. If someone dies with the cross on him, he'll be given a preliminary indulgence. None of that's in the Bible. Now, that's exemplified by the God of Christianity. So if you're going to say Christianity as a religion is violent, that's plainly false. Say the Bible records honest history, I'd say that actually makes it more true. God bless you.